Hey everybody, Hollis Darby here with ArmySignalTraining, and in this video we're going to be going over the configuration of port security. Now this is video 2 of what will be a 3-video series over port security. So if you haven't had the opportunity yet to watch video 1, I highly recommend that you do so, just so that you have a fundamental knowledge of what port security is, the options that are available to you, and how you as the administrator can best adopt it into your network. Because in this video we're solely going to focus on the core configuration of building that secure MAC address table via dynamic, static, and the hybrid, which is sticky. Now the first thing that we need to know is this: to enable port security on a switch port interface, we must first hard code that interface as either an access port or a trunk port. You see, when we get a brand new Cisco switch in the mail from Cisco and we plug it into our network, all the interfaces are in something called dynamic auto. And I'll demonstrate that here. If I do a show interface fast Ethernet 0/1 switch port, I can see that the administrative mode is still in dynamic auto. Which means if I go to actually enable port security on that interface, the command's actually going to be rejected. It's going to essentially tell me, hey, you need to either make me access or you need to make me a trunk. And depending on your particular implementation will determine as to whether it needs to be an access or a trunk. But in our scenario here, it's going to be an access port because it's just going to a personal computer. So the first thing I'm going to do is go into fast Ethernet 0/1, which is the interface that we're going to be working with. And I'm going to hard code it as an access port by typing in switch port mode access. Now that I've done that, I have the ability to enable port security on this interface. So we're going to start off with dynamic. So to enable dynamic port security on that switch port interface, all we need to do is type in switch port security. Enter. That is now running port security on that interface. The problem is there's a lot of defaults that are running in the background. For example, the default violation shutdown mechanism is, the default violation mechanism is shutdown. The maximum number of MAC addresses that will be allowed to be learned on the ingress side of that interface is 1, and we may or may not want that to be our desired result. It just depends on your implementation. See, in a lot of places, we tend to piggyback our personal computing devices off of Cisco IP phones. In which case, if we left it just at 1 MAC address allowed, just the IP phone will be able to come online. So you may or may not need to tailor that number depending on your application in your network. But I'll show you how you can do that here. It's real simple. To increase the number of allowed MAC addresses on that interface, we simply type in switch port security maximum, followed by the number of maximum MAC addresses we want to be allowed to be learned on that interface. So I could say like 2 or 8. Just depends on what you need. And in my case, I'm going to leave it at the default at 1. With this command here, you can actually look at the port security parameters that are configured on an interface. If I do a show interface fast Ethernet 0/1, or excuse me, show port security interface fast Ethernet 0/1, these are all the port security parameters configured on that interface. As we can see here, that because I issued the port security command up top, port security is enabled. It's currently in a secure down because, well, actually I have nothing plugged into it yet. The violation mode by default is at shutdown. The 3 different violation modes are protect, restrict, and shutdown. The aging 0, the aging type is absolute, the secure addressing is at disabled. We'll talk about that in a 3rd video. The maximum MAC addresses allowed is set to 1, right here. The total MAC addresses I'll learn is 0. The total number of statically defined MAC addresses is 0. The total number of sticky MAC addresses is 0. And the last known MAC address that's learned, in this case, is none, because nothing's been plugged in. And the big one here, the security violation count, is at 0. and we want it to stay at 0. Because, my friends, if that increments up, you've had a violation. So let's go in, and now that we've set up dynamic, let's get it to learn a MAC address. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to reach over here and plug in my computer into that interface. And let me get my computer to process some frames here. See, the line protocol is up. So if I issue that show port security interface fast Ethernet 0/1 command again, we'll see now that before it was secured down, now it is secure up. Before it didn't know of a MAC address, now it dynamically learned this MAC address on its own. Now, as you're seeing everything that I'm doing, so I didn't tell it about that MAC address. It dynamically learned that because it was the first MAC address that came across the ingress side of that interface. And so it bound itself to it. Now, if we incremented the total number of MAC addresses allowed up to, let's say, 2, it will allow more than just this one interface to come across, or one MAC address to come across. So that essentially is dynamic. It's like pretty straightforward, easy to set up. Nothing too granular about it. We just have to be mindful of a couple of things. Are you allowing the total number of MAC addresses you actually need to traverse into that interface? And we also need to ensure that port security is actually enabled by ensuring that the switch port interface is set as either an access or a trunk. Alright, next thing we're going to go over is how to statically define. See, with dynamic, to take a step back real quick, with dynamic, this is nowhere in my running config. If I do a show run interface fast Ethernet 0/1, there's no MAC address there. So as soon as my switch loses power, or we do a reboot on the switch itself, the next first MAC address that it learns on the ingress of the interface is going to be the one it binds to then. So there's not a whole lot of control there. Whereas we can actually manually, as the administrator, go into the switch port interface and define exactly what MAC address has to come across that interface. So I'm going to go ahead and unplug my computer from that interface real quick, and I'm going to show you how to statically define a MAC address. So I'm going to go back in, config t interface fast Ethernet 0/1. So to statically define a MAC address, we're going to go switch port, port security, MAC address, followed by the MAC address in this format here. So it'll be 4 digits, period, 4 digits, period, 4 digits, period. Now I'm going to make up a MAC address just so you can see what happens if a violation occurs and how you can manually go in and recover that interface. So let's do 0011.222.333. So that's the MAC address. So I've statically defined that MAC address. If I back out here, let's do a show port security interface fast Ethernet 0/1. Now let's look at some of the changes. Port security is still enabled. It's currently in its secured down because I have nothing plugged in yet. The violation mode is shut down. Aging, absolute, and secure static, none that's going to change. We'll talk about that in a later video. The total number of MAC addresses allowed on the interface is still 1. The total MAC addresses on that interface is 1. But notice this. The configured MAC address is 1. And because I'm using the same interface we were earlier, it still remembers my laptop as being the last known MAC address on the interface. So in this case, this is irrelevant at this point. But watch what happens when I plug my computer in. Now, keep in mind, this MAC address here is not going to change. But we've statically defined this MAC address to be the only MAC address authorized on that interface. So when I plug in what's now going to be my rogue device, generate a little frame here, we'll notice that the line protocol for fast Ethernet 0/1 has come up. And shortly as these frames start getting generated, we'll start seeing this bad boy get error disabled right there. Alright, so we get this other status message. This error disabled. A port security violation error was detected on Fast Ethernet 0/1, putting it in an error disabled state. And it keeps going on and on. What's great about this status message, and this is why it's good to offload these status message into a syslog server for review, is that it tells you right here, hey, a port security violation occurred, and it occurred by this MAC address on this interface. So as an administrator, I should be using good practice in documenting every device, or I should say every authorized device on my network. I should be annotating all the MAC addresses of our devices, our printers, our laptops, our PCs, our servers, our access points that are authorized to be on our network, and then kind of defining where and location in the building those are located, and if it's a personal computing device, to whom it belongs to. So that when we get messages like this, it's easy for us to track down to whom that device belongs to. And if we don't have a record of it and that MAC address pops up, we know that an erroneous rogue device was indeed put on our network. But thanks to port security, it was done so unsuccessfully. But at this point, the port is shut down. If I do a show interface or show IP interface brief, look at Fast Ethernet 0/1. It says down, down. Okay, so if I do a show interface Fast Ethernet 0/1, says the interface is down, LAN protocol is down due to error disabled. So if I'm troubleshooting as to why this occurred, maybe I didn't see the syslog message, and I'm just trying to troubleshoot why this interface is down, and I see this error disabled here, the next thing I'm going to type in is show port security. Wow, right there. The secure port, in our case we only have one, which is Fast Ethernet 0/1, has a maximum secure address count of 1, which means it can only have one MAC address on that interface. The current count is 1, but the big one here is security violation count is now 1. That should always be 0. And because of that, the security action taken was to shut down the interface. I can also get a little more granular with it and do the show port security interface Fast Ethernet 0/1. And when I do that, I can see port security is enabled, the port status is secure shut down this time due to the violation of shutdown, and that this violation counter incremented from 0 to 1, and this is the MAC address or the culprit on our network. And lastly, I can do the switch port security address command. And what that's going to do is it's going to tell me exactly what MAC address was supposed to be on that device and the type of MAC address it is, which in our case it was security defined or statically defined, which means it was securely configured. Now, how do we undo this? Well, the first thing we want to do before we unshut that interface is to seek out and remove that device from our network. So I located the device, I unplugged the device, all is well. So I took the device off the network. I'm going to go in and go into the interface, Internet Fast Ethernet 0/1, and to recover it from error disabled state, I need to issue the shutdown command followed by the no shutdown command. I know it seems a little backwards, but you must first shut down the interface and then initiate the no shutdown command to bring it out of error disabled. Now if I do the show interface Fast Ethernet 0/1, we can see it's no longer connected, but it's not saying it's error disabled. I removed that device from the network, and if I didn't, we would just get in a vicious cycle of constantly error disabling the interface. Now that's how you statically define a MAC address for port security. Those are some of the show commands that you can use. See what's going on with port security, hunt down that rogue device or that MAC address that was in violation or uncompliant with your port security policy. Lastly, we're going to talk about sticky. So let me first go in here and remove that static assignment. Well, I guess I can leave it there. We'll work with fast Ethernet 0/2 now. So I want to establish a sticky MAC address. And what sticky is, it's a hybrid between a static MAC address and a dynamically learned. What I mean by that is this. It's going to reach out and it's going to find that first MAC address on that interface. And just like dynamic would. But the difference is dynamic doesn't save it to your running config. Static will actually, or sticky, will actually save it to your running config. Just like static would. When you statically configure a MAC address in port security, it's added to your running config. When you utilize the sticky command, when it dynamically reaches out and gets that first MAC address, it too will add it to your running config. Thus, when you save your running config, you bind it to your startup config. So we're going to use fast Ethernet 0/2, and I'm going to go in, so interface fast Ethernet 0/2. I'm just going to make sure that it's in switch port mode access first, switch port security, and then now switch port security MAC address. Now instead of specifically defining a MAC address, we're going to add this keyword here, sticky. Now, as of right now, this has done nothing for us. If I do show port security interface fast Ethernet 0/2, we can see that, well, port security is enabled. There is nothing plugged into it. There are no learned MAC addresses. Total number of allowed MAC addresses is 1. Nothing's really happened. But watch what happens when I plug in my computer to interface 2. Let's wait for the line protocol to come up. Let me generate some frames here, and let's issue that command again. Still waiting on it. There she goes. Okay, just took a little bit for my computer to generate some frames, but now on fast Ethernet 0/2, when we initiated the sticky command, we can see that port security is enabled. It is secure up. Violation mode hasn't changed. None of the aging policies have changed. We're still only allowing 1 MAC address. It's learn 1 MAC address. But look down here. Sticky MAC address is a learn is 1. And that MAC address is this right here. Now this, keep in mind, this :1 is the actual VLAN that's assigned to. But what's really cool about this is right here. If I do a show run interface fast Ethernet 0/2, voila. That line there was auto-magically added to the running config. All I typed in was switch port mode access, port security, and I told it to use port security MAC address sticky. That's all I did. But when it saw that first MAC address come across, it dynamically stuck it, hit sticky, to the running config. So when I go in and do a copy run start, it is now bound to my running config, thus my startup config. Well, I hope you learned something by this, and I really hope I didn't confuse you too much. The biggest things you need to know is this, that you have 3 different types of mechanisms, or 3 different ways of adding MAC addresses to your secure MAC address table. You can do it dynamically, which does not save it to your running config, thus does not save it to your startup config. You can do it statically, which does add it to your running config, and thus adding it to your startup config if you save your config. And sticky, which dynamically learns that MAC address, adds it to your running config, and when you save that running config, you got it. Binds it to your startup config. So I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. I'd really appreciate any questions or comments that you might have below, and have a good day.